Hello and welcome, everybody. This is a fireside chat, and we're going to talk about the Verizon DBIR with lead scientist Gabriel Bassett. So, do you want to say hi, Gabe?
Hi, thank you. I'm looking forward to it.
So, Edgescan have been sort of contributing to the Verizon DBIR for a couple of years in a modest kind of way. For anybody that's read the document, it's a very wide-ranging document in terms of data breaches and whatnot. And we're very, very lucky and fortunate to have Gabriel on the call for the next 45 minutes to talk about sort of his opinion of because he's done previous ones, many of the previous ones as well, and in terms of what's changed and where we're going and that type of thing. And it should be an interesting talk. So we're going to keep it sort of somewhat informal. So Gabriel, do you want to introduce yourself? Maybe we can just jump straight in and you can say hi.
Sure. Like I said, I'm Gabriel Bassett. I'm the lead data scientist for the DBIR. So I do a lot of the back end science portions of it. This year I did a lot of the figures, wrote a couple of the sections, made a few mistakes and things that we corrected. And this is something that I want to get to like near the end, is the fact that we all make mistakes in security, and it's really
100%.
working with each other that is going to help us solve the security problems that we have.
Amen. Yeah, we're all human after all. Just a brief introduction for myself. My name is Eoin Keary, CEO of Edgescan. We've been in the cybersecurity space for quite a long time, and on an annual basis, we tend to donate thousands of records to the DBIR team in order to help them build their models. So that's how myself and Gabe know each other. We've been working together maybe briefly every year for the last 3 years. So Gabe, let's just get straight into it, right? This year's Verizon DBIR, previous years, what would you say has changed, in terms of your contrast and compare, etc.?
So this is a fun one that, I think what a lot of people, were kind of asking or wanted to know from the DBIR this year was, did the pandemic cause a change in the security landscape? And one of the things that we want to kind of impress on people is that that causal science is hard. On the DBIR, we really do science. And so we can't really tell you, did the pandemic cause anything, but we can tell you what happened during the pandemic. And so there were a couple key trends that we saw. The first was around phishing and ransomware. Phishing and ransomware both outpaced the average. So we analyzed more breaches this year than previous years by a decent amount. And that doesn't mean that breaches grew, because we have kind of a sample of convenience. But ransomware and phishing were kind of outpacing the average. Those two things are growing. And this is no surprise, right? It only takes a quick glance at the news to see that those trends are still ongoing even after our collection period. Now, one of the things we found interesting was that credentials just kind of kept pace. Like, it didn't really grow as a percentage of breaches. And that for us was kind of surprising, because credentials is this really key thing that we'll probably get to talk about more as we go on. But when we stepped back and thought about it, we thought, maybe what's happening here isn't so much that credentials are just not growing, but that they've grown so big, or they are involved in so many breaches that they're running out of room to grow into, right? They're a huge part of breaches, and breaches across the different types of breaches. And so it may be the credentials is really just getting so big that there's not a lot of room, or as much room, for growth. And so it can't grow at those, double digit or large single digit percentages anymore. Now, on the other hand, something that we saw that went the opposite way was errors. And so for people that aren't familiar with the DBIR, one of the things we track are errors. And so when a breach is caused by someone's unintentional actions, there was no malice involved. or even no intentional action involved. This is a lot of times things like developers or administrators leaving cloud storage public, and then someone putting private data in it, or private data being put into cloud storage and then being changed to public so that that public data is exposed on the internet. It's also misdelivery. So if someone mails either physically or through email, mails private data to the wrong party. So, if you meant to mail, a dozen people medical records, each one of them their own medical record, and you accidentally sent the spreadsheet with everyone's records to everyone, that would be kind of an error. And one of the things we saw is that we saw errors not keep pace with the average. So it grew in absolute terms. We counted more error breaches this year, but as a percentage of all breaches, it actually went down. And so it was phishing that kind of pushed errors down as a percentage. And that was surprising because we honestly thought that we'd see errors going up as people were working from home and maybe not working in the same IT environment that they're used to working in.
Yeah, true.
So those were kind of the three big trends that we saw related to the data last year. And they do underscore a lot of the other findings as well.
Yeah, it's interesting to say that. I think everybody's aware of the current. Well, I'm not sure if it's more than usual, but some of the big ticket ransomware attacks, particularly there was one in the health service in Ireland was attacked a few weeks ago, and they're still trying to recover. And it's interesting. I'll maybe shortly we can talk about maybe the relationships between things like hacking and web breaches and ransomware, and sort of have you any insight in terms of that? So, talking about, you mentioned phishing attacks and stuff like that. Have you any information, or did you see anything around, okay, somebody gets infected with ransomware, somebody gets infected with malware, whatever it may be, is it always phishing attacks? What are the cause of it, or can it be more manual attacks where the attacker would plant the ransomware, or have you?
So the ransomware really kind of fell into these two patterns, and there's a slide we have that kind of does some principal component analysis clustering just to visualize the system intrusion pattern.
Sure.
For those that aren't familiar, the DBIR breaks the data down into different patterns that helps us kind of explain similar breaches. And we started that in 2014 with some heuristics based off of hierarchical clustering. And this year we completely updated our clustering methodology based off of spherical k-means clustering, more directly machine learning driven approach. And when we did that, we kind of discovered or evolved the clusters a little bit and the patterns. And so one of our patterns is system intrusion. And within it, we saw these two very distinct clusters in ransomware. And I should step back a bit and say the system intrusion pattern is an interesting one in that it's defined not by any individual thing, but by kind of a combination of things. Now, granted, 100% of this pattern has either hacking or malware, which are breach actions for us. So hacking is kind of like the hands-on keyboard, right? While malware is more obviously malware. And those kind of are two distinctions in the types of actions attackers take. But all the breaches in this category had one or the other of those. And what they really had in common, because we were having actually in this, so this is a fun thing, is like, so we do all this clustering, this machine learning, and then we look at these clusters and we go, what do they have in common? What is the defining characteristic of this cluster? And some of them were clear, like this one over here is just obviously errors. And this one over here is obviously social attacks, phishing, business email compromise, those kinds of things. And then we get to these few clusters and it just wasn't clear. They'd have a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and we're sitting there scratching our heads. And then I think it was Phil on the team looks and goes, how many actions are in these breaches? And so we go and look, and it turns out these are the breaches that had more complex actions in most cases. In fact, this is the only this pattern had more breaches that had 3 or 4 actions than 1 or 2. And the only other place that happened was in social, where you almost have to have 3 actions. Like you send the phishing email, they click the phishing email, and then like you have to have a couple interactions to make social attacks other than business email compromises work.
Sure.
And so it was just like these longer, more complex breaches, kind of what we think about when we think about hacking, right? Like mentally, we get this model of, if someone says a breach occurred, it's like someone got on keyboard and, they did an action, they like sent phishing email, or they used credentials, or found an exploit to get in, and then they pivoted around inside the organization, learned how it was all structured, put everything, laid all the malware, and then took over the whole thing, maybe dropped ransomware on all the systems. Very similar to kind of what we see in a lot of the breaches that pop up in the news. But that, that represents a portion of breaches, and that's what this kind of pattern represents. So it also doesn't represent all of them. There are all those other very short and common breaches as well. So, but I should get back to the ransomware question. I get habit of getting a little bit sidetracked.
Sure, don't we all? Yeah.
And so ransomware, I think, falls into kind of two categories. And the first is that quick and easy attack. The attacker sends a piece of ransomware email, or ransomware by email. Someone clicks it and it just kind of automatically encrypts what it has access to. And those are the ones that honestly I don't think we hear as much about, because they're so simple and untargeted that they probably just kind of float a little underneath the radar. But if you go look at the data we got from the FBI IC3 on kind of the losses to ransomware, you can see that the losses are in the tens of thousands of dollars a lot of times, which is not necessarily the big one. And then on the other side, you have those big ransomware attacks where the attacker, maybe bought access through a criminal forum or marketplace to, a specific organization. And then they went in, they really did kind of poke around, understand the organization. When they took it over in a much more holistic way, encrypting key parts with ransomware. And I think that there's really, it didn't necessarily appear in our report last year, but some of the breaches we've seen just recently in the news show kind of this evolving methodology in ransomware, where it used to be that they targeted organizations where you could target the operational technology, right? Target healthcare, target schools or public administration, where, you need this computer to, issue license plates or something. And these last couple of breaches are really interesting in that they targeted the billing system. And I almost get the feeling that maybe the attackers have realized we don't have to shut down the OT technology. If we shut down the ability for the business to bill, then we've shut down the business.
Sure.
100%. And when the business is down, then they have an incentive to pay us. And I think that there's kind of a really interesting evolution happening in ransomware around what they can target and get paid for. There was another pattern as well, which was the attackers not just ransoming the systems, but also stealing the data, right? We saw this huge increase in breaches, in ransomware breaches specifically. So for us, incidents are any compromise of confidentiality, integrity, or availability. But breaches are a disclosure of sensitive data to an unauthorized party. And so normally ransomware, if you just encrypt everything, that's just an incident, right? No data was lost. But this year we saw this increase in breaches. And so the attackers, again, as part of their evolution, we're not just dropping ransomware in the hopes that someone would pay them, but they were adding to the threat, either selling the data that they stole or blackmailing the company effectively to not disclose the data, which was a big trend from last year. And so ransomware is a large enough threat that the attackers are looking for ways to evolve and improve it to figure out, how do we make this a more effective attack? And I think that's a really scary characteristic of it.
I was gonna say, the idea that, hacking, system intrusion, web app security, all those types of manual attacks, sort of targeted. Obviously, it's targeted. A lot of the industry and the media talk about ransomware and malware, and they say don't click on emails, but it's a lot more than that, right? Like targeted attacks are not phishing attacks, or are they? What's your thoughts on that? And also in terms of, things like remote working, RDP, remote desktop, there's much more exposure. We saw a lot more exposure in terms of the Edgescan stat support. Much more exposure in terms of SSH and remote conduits to getting at systems increased by about 40% in last year. Do you think that has any sort of any holding on sort of, you know, the uptick as well?
Yeah, and this is something that I really want to do some more research in, is this idea of like, when we look at breaches, we look at our side, right? We look at the second the attacker touches our systems to the time they leave. But that's not really, that's one side. There's also everything that happens before and after. And that's a lot of times the involvement of the attacker in criminal marketplaces and trading. Like, you know, the malware has to come from somewhere. And attackers have these options. You know, you can build, you can buy, you can rent. They have the same options we have as organizations. And so, you know, and it's not just the malware itself, it's also the RDP connections, the SSH connections. And I think that there's, so one of the things we discovered this year, looking at honeypot data, is there seems to be this thing that's kind of like a sales funnel, right? Traditionally, there's this process people go through where, you know, you start with this larger population and you kind of narrow it down, and the attackers are doing something similar. So what we saw is that they spend a lot of days scanning, just looking. When we say scanning, we mean just like blindly, you know, touching ports on random ports on random systems. So that happens a lot. You know, and then the next step down was crawling for specific services. You know, in those cases, the attacker was looking for some service that they specifically planned to use. And then they spend an even fewer number of days looking for specific vulnerabilities, specific CVEs, right? And then finally, the smallest number of days were actually executing, you know, remote code execution type attacks, like actually attacking the services they found. And so there was this funnel that the attackers were using. And I think that there's maybe people have this, or organizations kind of have this view that if you haven't made it to the end of the funnel, you're not being targeted. And so I think that we need to step back and say, look, you know, if I have exposed any ports, the attackers are kind of aware of those. If those ports have CVEs on them that are, you know, likely to be exploited, the attackers are going to keep stepping down. And so my organization may be in that funnel on its way down to the end of it, even if I haven't reached the end of it. And I'm just kind of waiting for the attackers to get to me to attack, right? And so for organizations, it means spending more time following, kind of looking at the organizational surface and figuring out, what do I have that would be an easy path in for the attackers, right? Because the attackers, you know, are like us. They want the most efficient attack possible. And if they can easily find something like a RDP service or an SSH service or something with an exploit or a vulnerability, or easy credentials to log in, they're going to take that opportunity.
The route, exactly.
And they're going to sell them to each other too, right?
Just a reminder to people that have dialed in. You know, if you have any questions, you can push them up through the webinar software. So please feel free, because as you know, this webinar is particularly for your benefit, and we have Gabe in the room. So if you have any questions, we'll gladly pose them to Gabe. Okay, so what about web application security? Is that a big issue still? Is it a, you know, it's always been, you know, when you talk to the OWASP folks, me, which was one of them at one point, you know, web application security is where the risks at. Web application security is where all the vulnerabilities are. But in terms of you know, what you're seeing and what you saw in the last year, based on the report, what's your thoughts on web AppSec in general, and you know, how important of an issue is it when it comes to preventing breach?
So I think that web application security, I mean, web applications are clearly incredibly important, because it's where organizations are going, right? As organizations kind of shift from the mentality of, you know, a firewall, a server, and some desktops in a building, to, you know, my employees may be anywhere doing anything, and so I'm going to put my protection at the endpoint and provide them services. you know, those services most of the time aren't being provided by VPN, they're being provided by web app. So it's really clearly where organizations are going, and therefore it's clearly where the attackers are going. You know,
Yeah.
and so many organizations have made that shift already. The attackers are kind of already there. And so I think a lot of times as businesses shift from kind of make that digital transformation, and I always thought the term was kind of silly until we went through things last year, and it's like, oh, now I understand what digital transformation is. It's going from like someone working on a desktop, you know, in a building to being in a laptop in their house.
Sure.
And so like as organizations are forced to do that, they may not necessarily realize that the attackers are already there and already understand how to attack those services. Now, granted, a lot of times these services are being provided through cloud services where you get the security baked in, and the attackers are therefore attacking using credential stuffing and other types of credential attacks. But you also have kind of these basic web application attacks. In fact, we have a pattern around it with that very name, because the attackers look for these very consistent exploits, you know, that they can use very widely, and they're going to go and target those.
So Gabe, just to stop you there, would they be sort of the type of things you'd see in the OWASP top 10, for example, that type of thing, like SQL injections or cross-site scripting and that type of thing? Is that
we see a decent amount of SQL injection from when it comes to exploits. Cross-site scripting doesn't get listed a lot, but we see a lot of like web shells. That's a big one, is you know, an easy file include or something that results in web shells. Because the other side of this is that the attackers may not just be targeting your web application, but they may be using your web application as a platform for the rest, right? Because, you know, if I'm an attacker, like, you know, maybe I own my own infrastructure, but, you know, it'd be much more efficient if I just used your infrastructure for my infrastructure. And so if I can like turn your system into a multi-tenant system, you know, that's really good for me. It's not as good for you. But that's not really what the attackers are worrying about.
No, indeed. Good. Let's move on. This is something that gets my goal a lot. You know, maybe it's starting to taper off, but the industry, you know, is a business, and the business talks about the latest and greatest a lot, which I don't think has moved the dial in terms of getting anybody more secure. And any of the purists in the audience would probably agree that shiny boxes with lights or more software really isn't going to get us to where we want to go. But one of the things around that is 0 days. And, you know, I'd like to know what your thoughts are on this. So for me, 0 days are rare animals, and they will not be used lightly, and they can be sold for a lot of money, right? Should we care about 0 days, or looking at the DBIR and also looking at our own stats and the vulnerability stats report, which was released in January or February? We're seeing the majority of vulnerabilities are 3 to 5 years old, and like in terms of breaches based on CVEs and leveraging malware, leveraging CVEs as well. Obviously, are you seeing the malware leveraging stuff that is brand new that nobody knows about, as in a 0 day, or are you seeing the CVEs, you know, leveraging maybe a 2017 CVE or something like that?
So this is a fun one. So my father's a physician, and he used to, like, they have to have continuing education, right? And so the way he'd get that is he'd get these tapes every month from a pair of physicians that would review papers, like academic papers on current trends in medical. And these guys had a saying. It was, when we review a paper, do the exact opposite of what the paper's saying. And the reason was the reason they were reviewing this paper is this paper presented something unique, something exciting, different. And the reality was, if it happened to everyone, often it wouldn't be that exciting, unique thing. And this is something that applies to security as well, right? The reason you're seeing something interesting or exciting in the news is because it's not the thing that happens to everyone. You know, the thing that happens to everyone just doesn't get reported because it does happen to everyone. It's not novel. And so we see the exact same thing you do, which is that vulnerabilities that are being exploited are the older vulnerabilities. The attackers are looking not for the new ones, but for the older vulnerabilities. Those are the easy ways in. And right, in fact, there was a, I forget, I think it was CISA, the US government report, like maybe end of last year, where they reported that, yeah, it was these older vulnerabilities that are causing organizations to be vulnerable. And we've looked at this twice, like from an asset standpoint in organizations. And you go and you look at organizations, because a lot of times we see, like, anytime a new vulnerability comes out, right? People scan the internet and you see, oh, look, there's, tens of thousands of organizations that have this vulnerability open, that haven't patched it, a week or a month or a year after it's been released, But if you go and look at those organizations and then you look at all the other vulnerabilities they have open, they have the newest vulnerability open, but they also have the oldest vulnerability open. And, I haven't ever been able to, like, figure this out completely from the data, but kind of my suspicion is that what's happening is, like, there's, CentOS 5 or something that gets deployed and then just never gets patched. And so, yeah, it's going to have the newest vulnerability, but it's got every vulnerability that CentOS 5 has ever had, right?
Yeah.
And you're going to have those. And so you see these peaks in, like, 2010 and 2017 and 2013 around these really old, really consistent vulnerabilities. And those are what the attackers are looking for, right? They don't want to chase the new stuff. They want to chase the old, consistent stuff.
Yeah. Why do you say that is? Like, my own opinion would be that the old consistent stuff, they have nice workable exploit toolkits. They can probably use the same malware to exploit a variety of trusted and probably guaranteed, 100% exploitable guarantee type of thing in terms of those vulnerabilities. But also, some research I've done in the last year has been in relation to that sometimes malware can take hold and you leverage, the way we have CVSS scoring, and we have this idea of, between a 7 and a 10 is really bad. Maybe between a 5 and a 7 is bad. I think it's a pretty much a blunt instrument in terms, because there's context and stuff that we're missing. But, and then, scanners in effect saying that something's a critical risk or a high risk or whatever. But the idea that some malware actually would leverage lower or medium risk, in quotes, vulnerabilities. But they're sometimes the types of vulnerabilities that people aren't patching, because maybe they're only focusing on the critical risk. So if it isn't a CVS 8 to 10 or 9 to 10 or whatever, those things are getting put on the back burner because people are busy and people have other stuff to do, right? And they can't patch everything. So would you have any advice in terms of maybe how to be better at this?
No, I think it's a really interesting conundrum, right? Is this idea of, we've got this mentality, we know we need to patch, like, but that's a very broad statement. And I think organizations can benefit from really stepping back and saying, what I want to do is I want to manage my externally available attack surface. What can the attackers see, easily, and then attack easily? And in managing that, maybe the question is, if this is something that you have trouble patching or can't patch, why is that? And does it really need to be on the internet? Instead saying, okay, if I can make stuff less discoverable, less visible to the attackers, move it inside so that, it's no longer the most easily or obviously interactable vulnerability. Like, if you're inside the organization, that thing that was really bad on the internet is probably one of a dozen things inside. Then we need to start stepping back and saying, okay, what do I not patch? Right? Because every patch is, it's time, it's risk to the organization, it's cost. And so stepping back and saying, okay, how do I manage my external attack surface? Can the things that have to be on the internet, can I fairly quickly in an automated fashion patch them because the attackers are going to target them that way? And what can I move away from my easily discoverable attack surface such that I can then start looking and saying, what do I really need to patch? Because this thing is going to be targeted, or maybe it's not going to be targeted, right? And there's ways to go and figure out what the attackers are targeting. And so I think that that's a good approach to think, how do I make my asset management both from a asset and vulnerability perspective, efficient, because that's what the business needs.
And what about the idea, there is this sort of a traditional view that we'll focus on patching externally internet facing stuff, but we're not going to be as good or as vigilant in terms of our internal systems. And the argument I would have on that is that look, if malware does get in, if you're not patched, it will spread much quicker. To be very sort of black and white about it.
Yeah, it depends certainly on the type of vulnerability, right? You wouldn't want to leave Bluekeep vulnerable inside or outside. Yeah. On the other hand, that vulnerability in that 10-year-old software that's used by one portion of the organization that you just can't get rid of, but it's only like 5 users that use it. The attackers are probably not going after that. They're going after something because like you said, it's not efficient to go write a exploit and make the code reliable if no one really uses this internally, when you probably have the ability to use something like a Bluekeep, a very common, documented vulnerability, or you can use the various ways of pivoting off credentials internally, or even just use the access to an email address to mail someone, say, hey, can I have access to this?
We've got a question here. I'll read it out. It's a difficult one, I think, but look, the spotlight's on you, Gabe. It's around what measures can we take if using a plugin of a CMS, so a content management system, which is found to have a vulnerable 0-day. So if you have I'm guessing this is the case where there's no patch for it. What would you do in that case, or what? Go for it.
I think there's a couple of approaches to this. One, I think that hosted CMSs sometimes make a lot of sense because you get the benefit of the economies of scale. Yeah. And the people who are managing are much more efficient at keeping them up to date. Having run CMSs before, they are not always easy to continuously stay ahead of. And certainly the attackers attack plugins and CMSs. Like, in fact, a couple of years ago, I had to run to a local store. I was friends with the manager there, and he said, hey, we've got this problem on our website. People are getting weird links from it. Right. And when looked, it turned out it was an exploit in a vulnerable plugin. Yeah. On the other hand, I don't think that attackers, if a new vulnerability comes out, the question is how quickly are the attackers going to produce a viable attack that is, and then it's executed against everyone. Yeah. Versus how quickly the patch is going to come out. Sure. And the reality is, it's more than likely that you'll be able to get the patch and deploy it in a reasonable and secure manner before the attackers exploit everyone in the world.
That's a good point. Yeah.
On the other hand, you have to have that process, right? You can't sit back and say, well, we'll consider patching our CMS plugins when it's shown that the attacker, that people exploit them. We know people exploit those kinds of things, so you need to be prepared to patch them or to stop them.
Yeah. I suppose the good thing about that question is, knowing that you have a vulnerability is the first good step. Visibility, et cetera, et cetera. In the interest of time, we'll move on. So something that stood out to me a lot, and you mentioned it already, in this chat, was about credential compromise. Yeah. And it's used an awful lot. Credential stuffing is another thing which is a big problem. Like, for people that don't know what that means, it's the idea of stealing credentials and then using them across lots of websites, because people reuse the same passwords a lot of the time, right? What's your thoughts on two things? The uptick in credentials, but also how are these people getting these credentials? How are these hacker threat agents? Is it malware, or is it hacking, or is it a combination of both?
So I think this is a really interesting one, in that our data kind of splits in two sides, because on the DBIR, one of the focuses, we look at breaches of organizations, not necessarily individuals. So if my family member gets malware on their laptop, that doesn't necessarily go directly into the DBIR. On the other hand, we have this set of data of 220,000 plus botnet infections. And those are where, a customer downloads a piece of malware, it steals their credentials, but then it goes and compromises their account at an organization. And just by the scale, right? 220,000 in a single data set, that's a ton. It's huge. And granted, one of the reasons it's got the scale is because you can't turn those breaches, those compromises don't, turn directly into a larger compromise. Like, if someone steals my bank account credentials, they can log into my bank account and do bad things to my bank account, but they can't necessarily go steal all the money at the bank.
Yeah.
And so there's that one side of it, which is kind of those botnet type breaches. And then there's the side of credentials that are kind of used in the process of the breach, right? The attackers stole them as part of kind of this consistent multi-phase approach. And so, those are going to be much less volumetric, right? The attackers are, using each credential once. And the reality is that the attackers are already on a system that's internal with malware of some type. The credentials offer them less obvious access, but don't necessarily offer them different access because the attacker can use the malware as a pivot point through to do what else they want. So there's the two different approaches, and the one appears much bigger than the other. But the credentials themselves come from several different places. The credentials can come from errors, right? Someone leaving a database of login credentials on the internet. They can come from, like we said, malware stealing the credentials. They can come from just credential stuffing, or phishing, and then credential stuffing, like you talked about. And credential stuffing, we had some good data that was just huge, right? Like for organizations that were monitoring for these malicious logins, the average organization, or the median organization, I should say, saw 3 credential stuffing attempts on average for every 2 minutes of the year. But it was a range. Some organizations saw less than 2 per day on average, and some saw over 3 billion login attempts per year, which averages out to about 100 plus a second. Right.
Yeah.
And so the attackers are doing this, and they're collecting just huge amounts of credentials. Like, as an organization, if you're not protecting your credentials, you're not protecting your organization.
So one of the arguments, Gabe, is using multi-factor, which it is a good argument, right? Because even though they have your credential, they may not have the Google Authenticator or the SMS or whatever to get that next step. But then there are other arguments where businesses are reluctant to implement multi-factor because it causes more friction for the user to log in, right? Good.
When I started, my first DBIR was the 2015 DBIR. My first as the lead data scientist was in 2016. And I think in 2016, I said, now is the year that you need to be implementing two-factor authentication. And I think that still holds. 2016 was the year you should have been implementing two-factor authentication. It does add friction on logins, but the reality is we've gotten better at it. There are solutions that are, apps on your phone that you just click, or, even just receiving a message by email, or having, a dozen different ways, or having a little device that just sits in your USB port that you just touch. We've gotten pretty good at getting it out of the way to the point where it's really a needed solution. And even though, attackers have ways to sometimes bypass two-factor authentication, certainly in a lot of the attacks where they are like a lot of the fraud type attacks, right? Talking people into stealing money from their bank account, they have, talk people out of their second factor. Like anything you can do to increase the attack path for the attacker, add steps, decreases it significantly. We've got this chart that shows that, the curve from the number of attacks, it goes from here and then it just slopes down as the number of steps in the attack gets longer. And so you want to do that to the attacker, make them take more steps.
Because it gets less profitable, or they'll go somewhere else. Yeah.
they're going to go to the easiest target.
Yeah, 100%. Like the old saying, outrunning the bear.
Yeah, that very much applies to security.
Indeed, it does. Something else that stood out for me was DDoS. It's still a popular technique, and I've always thought that, well, why would me as an attacker pay for cloud? If I don't even know if they pay for cloud, but let's say they do, or resources to do DDoS attacks, when ransomware is a much more sort of, well, if you can get in, you can fire and forget and wait to get paid. So, what's your thoughts on that one?
I think it probably is the same reason that attackers, still use credit card skimmers at, gas stations. Like, there's a huge more on the ecosystem. If you specialize in an area where there are less people, there's more for you. And so DDoS is, in the one case, it's this easy attack that is just still absolutely ubiquitous. It happens a ton. It gets blocked. All sorts of different ways. And the attackers can benefit from it either by ransom, in that, if you don't pay us, we're going to keep DDoSing you, or by, more often, it's, I DDoS a competitor and cause them to go offline so that, the business comes over to me. The good news, right, is that DDoSes are really easy to stop, right? You hire a service, they stop the DDoS, and it goes away. Ransomware still is a much more and plus, these are things that you just sign up, you go to a web form and you put in what you want and you get a DDoS. Ransomware still requires a lot more technical investment from the attacker. It's more steps, more process.
Yeah. And from a victim standpoint, it's probably harder to defend against, because ransomware can come in it can be delivered in so many different ways, and it can be customized, if it's,
it's certainly kind of a step up in attack. And this is something I've been discussing with a couple of people, is this idea of trying to balance your defenses from a maturity standpoint with the attacker's offense. And so Wardley talks about, these different levels of maturity from, it's this brand new genesis of a new type of thing, and then you have solutions that are custom built. Then you have just products that you can do it or rent it, and then it becomes a commodity. And so ransomware still is it's moving from that custom built to that product rental stage, but DDoS is very much a commodity. And so from a defensive standpoint, you need to have the same thing, right? Your defense against DDoS is a commodity action, but your defense against ransomware still is probably in the product rental kind of phase, or even maybe is custom. It's not something where you can just push a button or have a product that solves it.
No, I agree. Yeah, there's a lot of moving parts when it comes to ransomware.
Yeah,
we're running out of time, so I want to maybe cover. I think the last question is important. Where do you think we're going for the rest of the year? And have you any predictions for the next DBIR?
Oh, so predictions are an interesting thing, and especially one of the points for this year was it's hard to predict the future, especially in complex systems. I mean that in the graph complexity sense, kind of the academic definition of it. In fact, we kind of show that with the double pendulums in the report, and that you can't predict where they'll be. And so, what I really think is that for organizations, there are going to be big ones. There's going to be that unique attack, whether it's the big DDoS or credential stuffing attempt, or the time until the next attack, or whatever the new unique thing is, or you finally make it to the bottom of that attacker sales funnel. And those are these unique things that you're not going to have a lot of success predicting, but they are going to keep happening. On the other hand, you have things that you can expect to happen: ransomware, business email compromise, phishing, DDoS, credentials attacks, and other things are going to keep happening. And so those are the things you can build solutions for, because it takes some time to build a solution and engineer it. And so, but those things will still be around, right? Your attack surface is still going to be around, and attackers will still be scanning it, looking for the services that are vulnerable and have been for years. And so you engineer for those solutions. You train your operations for the unique attacks, right? That tail that you can't try to solution your way out of. You need to have security operations to handle that. And so, you know, a long way to say my prediction is that the common things are going to continue to be common, and the uncommon things are still going to happen. And you need to have the right balance of solution for each one of them.
Yeah, it's good. It's very good. Well, we got one final question in here, so we'll cover it, and then we'll have to call it a day, because you know, I'd be lying if I said this is a 45-minute webinar and we're 3 minutes over. So, but the question is around threat actors, and do you see any trends with internal threats? You know, anything, you know, that was different in terms of internal threat actors, you know, in the last few reports? Have you seen anything moving in a certain direction?
Not a lot. Like, internal actors still tend to kind of be the same thing. Obviously errors are committed by internal actors as well as misuse. But I'd like to think about the majority of internal malicious actions are misuse of privileges, which when you come to think of it, it's like a credential breach, except the person legitimately had the credentials. And so I think that you can, when dealing with internal threats, you can take your protections against external threats and then use of credentials externally and apply them kind of to internal threats as well, to look for where a credential is being misused. But again, it's not the biggest threat. It should not be the first thing that you go after as an organization. Yeah,
that's interesting. You know, we're Edgescan based. We're based in Dublin, Ireland, and you know, there's a lot of tech, particularly in Dublin, and talking to some investigative journalists, you know, in terms of internal threats, it's more of a HR problem, really, I guess. But the word on the street is that Dublin is sometimes, it looks like the Czech Republic in the 80s, from the point of view of espionage. And the idea would be is that nation states are getting people hired into tech companies as insider threats, which is interesting. So people are being hired as developers and IT people, but they're actually working for nation states. So
espionage does happen, but you know, if you think about how often, like how efficient and how well phishing works, you know, and the amount of effort it would take to get your plant hired inside an organization versus just, you know, phishing anyone in the leadership chain, you know, like, you know, it's like, I could invest in that, but you know, this other thing seems really easy. You know, maybe I'll try it first.
That's true. Good. So Gabe, thanks for your time. I hope everybody that joined, you know, learned a little bit about the DBIR. You know, just Google it. It's there. It's a great report. And hopefully we can do this same time next year when the 2022 report comes out. But thanks for your time, man. I appreciate it. It
was my pleasure. I'm looking forward to the next one already.
All right. Thanks. Take care.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody. See you. Bye-bye.